Let's talk about cash flow all year round, the part of your business that determines whether you can breathe easy or feel like you're constantly playing catch up. This session will help you plan for your slow season, pace your spending, and understand the timing of your money, and build the financial habits that keep your business stable all year long.
Hey team, thanks for joining me for the session where we're going to dive deep into cash flow. I'm Coach Morgan, and I'm joined today with Rob Bednarz, who came in all the way from Chicago to talk cash flow with us. So Rob, I'd love to start off. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and tell the team about your current business, High Caliber Electric?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Morgan. So I'm Robert Bednarz. I'm the founder and CEO of High Caliber Electric. We're based out of the Chicagoland area. I have a pretty extensive background in the trades. Been involved in a lot of different companies, some exits, just all plumbing, electrical, and HVAC. So I pretty much know all those trades, but my main background is in electrical. So I started this company earlier this year, and we have a pretty hefty goal that we want to hit. We want to hit 150 million in 5 years, which we have a pretty clear roadmap on how to hit that. And I think a lot of things that we're going to talk about today is how we get there.
Love that. I was really excited that you and I were going to get to do this cash flow section together because, talking to you a little bit about your background and some of your prior work, seeing and helping businesses scale and then exit. So seeing that whole private equity, mergers and acquisition side of businesses that are really large and now coming back at it again from the startup space and looking to aggressively scale, I think you have some great perspective about cash flow. So let's start off first though by tackling the elephant in the room, which is cash flow means a lot of different things, right? There's a lot of different ways that we throw that phrase around. So whenever you came in to talk about cash flow for this session, I'd like to ask, what was the first thing that you thought of? Like, how do you think about cash flow?
So I think about cash flow as the money that's coming into business every day. So the money we're collecting on job sites, at the end of the jobs when they're done. So the money that would actually coming into the bank account every day is cash flow. We're not waiting on payments, not outstanding invoices. It's the money that we're continuing to collect every day, every week, every month, wherever it is, which we look at a lot of different metrics in our business. But we like to look at that daily and weekly cash flow so we can kind of project how we're going to run the company in the future.
That's excellent. So really solid foundation. First way we want to think about cash flow is within our sales and our collections. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that. But also you and I had been talking about a moment ago, we say in business that cash is king. But one of the things that I hear Coach Ketma say is but credit is queen. So How do you think about the credit side of cash flow and how does that play in?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important to have lines of credit in business, especially as contractors or in the trades. You want to set up, you want to negotiate your deals with your vendors. You don't want to be paying for your product right out. So you set up lines of credit with your vendors. That way you grab your material, you don't have to pay that. I set up net 90 terms. So, okay. They'll start you off at net 30, but the more you build that credibility and you build that relationship with the vendor, you can get out to net 90 and there's really no interest on that. So you got to negotiate with your vendors in order to benefit the company. So that way you're not shelling out cash for the materials that you're using, but you're collecting a down payment. That's how we do it. We collect down payments before we even start the job, and then we float that money on the materials. So we don't have to pay for those materials until we get paid for the job. So that really helps with cash flow. So you're not draining the bank account, but you're getting paid and you can continue to do payroll, you can continue to do marketing. So it's very important that you set up those lines of credits with your vendors. And whatever it may be, if you're financing vehicles, we finance all our vehicles, which is another line of credit. And we just utilize credit a lot, and cash flow is good as well. We try not to pay cash for things if we don't have to.
Okay, there's some really, really high impact takeaways on that. So I just want to say it back to you. So it sounded like what you were saying is we want to think about credit is a really important item to leverage so that we can hold on to the cash in the bank account even longer. And you said a couple of things that were really high impact that I just want to highlight. So the first one you mentioned was lean on your vendor relationships, because most of your vendors, your materials vendors, are going to give you really great terms, as in 0% interest for a period of time. You mentioned that usually you start on 30-day terms, but I don't know if you guys heard that. Key takeaway, go back and talk to those vendors and see if you've had a relationship, you've been paying well, see if you can stretch those out. So you said most of your terms right now are more like net 90.
Net 90, yeah. We try to pay them sooner, obviously, as soon as we can. But if we have to, we don't do so many bigger jobs anymore. Now we're all residential, so we won't have to stretch it out as much. But a lot of contractors that I know in the space, they're doing bigger jobs, so they're not getting paid for 60 days, they're not getting paid for 90 days.
Right.
So it gives you that utilization in order to pay your guys and not have to worry about paying that material until you get paid for the job.
Yeah, so that I think was the other keynote that you mentioned. So if you can work that into your vendor relationships, you can float those material costs. It's not costing the business anything if you're not having to pay interest on that. And your hard costs with your team, right? Your labor costs that you have to pay no matter what, whether you've been paid or not, are the places that you can apply the cash that you are bringing in. And then you mentioned a little bit about when you're making that sale. So whenever we go in, you mentioned about deposits and being able to use those deposits earlier on to help make those payroll purchases. Tell me a little bit about how you structure deposit payments.
Yeah, so absolutely. We do 50% payment on site. So we can go into a little other tools that we use at House Call Pro, the proposal tool, and how we go through the sales service, which I think we'll talk about in other segments here. So I won't dive too heavy into that.
Okay.
But we're selling our jobs at the kitchen table on site with the customer. We're going through options. And then we ask for that commitment right there on site, the 50% down payment. And then when we complete work, we're collecting payment on site as well. So we're not leaving, our techs aren't leaving, our electricians, HVAC, comfort consultants, whatever it is, aren't leaving the job site until they collect that final payment.
Okay.
A lot of people, you don't want to be chasing your money down. So if your guys leave the job site, it's harder to get that money because, it just is. It's a reality. So people, you got to be calling customers, and that takes time away from other things that your office staff can be doing.
Right.
So if you collect payment right there, it's just more efficient. You got your money, and it's a win-win situation for everyone.
Totally. I know some of you guys heard that and you felt that some of your legs are so tired from chasing payments all of the time, right? So you mentioned, so your sales process is really focused on, I think you said, so you get a 50% deposit at the time that they book and commit the job. So before the team even shows up to perform service, you guys have already started a cash flow from that project.
Absolutely.
And then you said the second part of that is when you guys wrap up the project, exactly what does that look like? You mentioned that you guys are really focused on collecting on the spot.
Yeah.
So tell me about that.
Yeah, so just to touch on the initial portion as well, obviously collecting 50% payment, you have to build trust with your customer first before you can ask for that deposit.
Okay.
And your branding and everything goes into that. So if you build up that trust with the customer, they're gonna feel comfortable giving you that 50% down payment.
They don't want to hand 50% to someone who's gonna run around or be gone the next day that they can't get a hold of, right?
Right, or you're pulling up in a white beat up truck, or you're not presenting yourself as a professional. So that all goes into being able to operate this way.
Okay.
And as far as final payment goes, obviously we're having a discussion with the customer while we're wrapping up the job. We'll say, hey, we're getting close to the end. We just want to know how you're going to be handling payment, whether it's a check, whether it's a credit card. We take all forms of payment. If it's a finance job, you don't have to collect payment because that's going through the financing firm or whoever you're using.
Yeah.
But yeah, we start initiating that conversation before we start wrapping up the job. That way it just eases the customer into it. And then we walk the customer through the job, make sure they're happy with everything first. We're not going to collect payment if they're unhappy.
Okay.
So we walk them through, show them what we did, and we ask them, is this everything that we had under contract? Is this everything that you wanted?
Okay.
And then if they're happy, we say, okay, it's time to collect payment, and we collect payment.
Great. So you're hitting all of those notes as far as making sure that you've clearly communicated with them, everyone's on the same page, job's completed, they're happy with the scope of work. That sounds like it's your opportunity to address any items that might be lingering, so you don't have to bicker about the payment after the fact. So it sounds like, have you trained all of the members of your team, or do you have a specific member of your team that shows up to do these final walkthroughs and collect payment?
Yeah, so we have a pretty extensive sales system and a service system, we like to call it. So all our techs are trained on how to collect payment. They're trained on every aspect of the business. That way, if you get Jake, or if you get Quinn, or if you get Keith, you're going to get the same experience with all of them. Okay. So we don't differ. We have operating procedures that we stand by, systems and processes in place that we try not to differ as much. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit different for each tech,
right?
Because we like them to use their personality and be charismatic.
Yeah.
We don't want them to sound like a robot, like, it's time to take payment. So, but, we want them to be comfortable asking for payment. But the customer-facing experience is very, overall good.
Very cool. So with that in mind, and having such a dedicated system that really focuses on the upfront deposits, collecting payments at the point where we wrap up the jobs, what would you say, what percentage of your jobs are you collecting at the time the job closes versus what percentage are you having to chase sometimes?
Right now, it's probably 95% we're collecting.
Nice.
So yeah, so there's There's obviously times where you don't finish the job, or there's a little bit you got to come back for. You know, we just had one the other day that I remember, which my tech called me because we had like 2 hours to come back and do just labeling the panel, just cleaning up a little bit, wiring or whatnot.
Nice.
And it was already 7 o'clock, so we didn't want to stay in. These people are about to sit down and have dinner. So we wanted to get out of there here. But we could have collected like 80% of the final payments.
Yeah.
But we don't like to do that. We just, we like to wrap up the job because we were already coming back the next day.
There you go.
So our techs came back the next day and then they collected the payment once they were all done.
Okay, exercised a little bit of discretion there.
Yeah.
So one thing that you mentioned, and this is a good operational takeaway for you guys that are going to be, either you already are doing that final collection of payment when you wrap up a job, or maybe you're going to start, that's a really great operating KPI to be tracking for your team. We think a lot about sales, and for our comfort technicians, tracking that close rate. Let's track that collection rate for your techs that are wrapping up jobs too, because if you start to see someone who's not quite hitting the same rates as everyone else, it's a good coaching opportunity that really helps with your business's cash flow.
Yeah, absolutely. And one point on that is if you're using the app right, House Call Pro, when they finish the job, it automatically just prompts them to take payment.
Okay.
So if you train now your techs on how to use the CRM right, it should just be seamless and it should be easy.
So it's helping them remember, it's helping to keep it all
and we
going.
do weekly trainings on how to use the CRM right, make sure that, because we have new guys coming in all the time, so we just want to keep hitting and keep reminding them how to use the CRM. This is how we do our system, and this is how we collect payment.
Keeps
that way,
everyone on track.
Exactly, because it's easy. If you don't train on it or you don't keep up on it, people start going rogue.
But the system works if you work the system, right?
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
what we're doing. And you mentioned a little bit, and we were talking before about financing and where financing fits into the sales process and how it helps with cash flow. Could you tell me a little bit, like maybe somebody who's listening who hasn't started using financing, maybe they've turned it on, but they're not actively offering it to customers. And I think, to be honest, a lot of the time people hesitate a little bit with financing because they're looking at that and they're thinking, they're going to take a slightly larger processing percentage for a financing plan. But what have you seen, and why have you found that that's a really good idea for how you do sales? And what would you recommend other pros consider?
Yeah, so financing is key. That's number one, I think, in my business. And it's number one if you want to scale. If you want to sell big ticket items, right now, I think the average amount of money that American has in their bank account is about $5,000.
Oh, wow.
So if you're asking someone to give you $10,000 for a panel change or whatever it may be, if you're doing an HVAC system, you're asking for $30,000, $40,000.
Right.
So if you could break it up into monthly payments and you know how to offer financing, we have a lot of different tactics that we go through and different processes in order to bring this up to the customer. We can just say, hey, why not use our money rather than yours? So if you introduce it right, it's very easy to go into it. And if you lead with it, you don't want to lead with cash, like, hey, this is a $30,000 system. You want to lead with, hey, this system could be $198 a month. So it's very affordable. And we have some great vendors that we use. Whatever you want to call it, some people don't like using financing. Some people like to call it promotions. There's a lot of different things, and I think that you got to just structure what's best for your business and your personality and your techs.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're going to close a lot bigger ticket items if you're using financing. You're leading with it, and you're going to see your conversion rate go way up if you start leading with financing. That's a little bit different at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's game changer.
Yeah, you hit on something really, really powerful there, I think, which is the idea of how we frame the cost of these things to our customers. So we've talked a lot about business cash flow and how we think about, we talked earlier about use some credit, right? Get things on terms so that you can spread out those payments. It's easier for you. And the idea of being able to offer financing to your customer is now you're thinking about your customer's cash flow, right? If your customer is cash flow tight, if they don't have a lot of cash in the bank account, then the idea of a really large project is just totally out of scope. It's not something that they can even consider.
Scary.
Yeah, totally scary. And you mentioned, framing it that way, instead of focusing on that top dollar item, it's like, this is very accessible. This is what your monthly payments can look like. You need a new HVAC system. Here's how we can make it really accessible for you. You kind of got their back with helping keep their cash flow in mind too.
Absolutely. And if you think about it, it's like people rarely are they saving up for their HVAC system to go out or their panel to burn, It's not like, you're not like, oh, I'm putting this $100 away from my check every month just in case my HVAC goes out.
Every time you toggle your HVAC, you're like, oh, let me put 20 bucks aside. No, if only.
It's usually like they're calling you, they're like in need. You want to obviously be empathetic towards your customers and you want to have options for them. So if they don't have the $30,000, because most people don't, you want to have an option for them to give them financing to break that down into monthly payments.
Really good. A couple of other notes that I wanted to make sure that we looked at. One of the things that you and I were talking about before is how we think about cash flow a little bit differently in different phases of business growth. So you've really run the gamut from really large operations at scale, and now you're back in startup territory, aggressively scaling. And so we were talking a little bit with a couple of the other pros a minute ago about maybe a good way of putting it is like when we get to a point in business where we're offered really big jobs that are really enticing, we want that big paycheck, but they're slow to pay, versus sometimes the smaller jobs, maybe the more residential stuff that's faster to pay, so a little bit easier on the cash flow. How are you thinking about that right now in terms of what jobs you say yes to, what jobs are a maybe, what's a hell no? How do you think about that and where you are in the business, and how would you encourage other pros to think about it too?
Yeah, so it's an extremely dynamic situation. You need to sit down and be realistic with yourself, where your business at, where your cash flow's at, and where you stand as a business. If you're a startup business, you're not going to take on a $100,000 remodel that pays net 60 or net 30, because you still got to pay your guys, you got to pay your materials. So that's not realistic, even though we're entrepreneurs. So it's easy to say yes to everything because it's right there, they're dangling in front of you, and you want to bite. So it's hard to say no to a lot of things, but if you don't say no early, you're going to fail quickly, and it's going to be devastating for you and the people that you're supporting. So you just need to be realistic with yourself, and you need to say, where am I at with my business? What can I afford? If you have deep pockets, I don't know, maybe you have a huge investor or something, you can take on those bigger projects, then go ahead. But most companies, if they're greenfielding, they're starting from the bottom, they don't have a huge angel investor or a line of credit. You need to just start with smaller projects that you can collect right away, that you can realistically get done and realistically finance. So it's important to just be real with yourself and understand where you're at as a business.
So if we were going to try to tie that into, it's a theoretical or an example, but if we try to tie that into some hard numbers about if somebody presents a project to you and it starts to look like this size of a project in terms of what it's going to cost you and how long you're going to have to carry that cost, you're in your first year of the business, you're already hitting really aggressive revenue goals. So you're in that, 3 to 5 million stage of growth this year. You're going to be really aggressively increasing that over the next couple of years. For you personally, what do you think about when a project comes your way, or if something came your way, you'd be like, that's the line where I'm not willing to take that right now based on, until, like you said, if you have a really large line of credit or you have large cash reserves, which we'll talk about in a minute. So what would you say? What would you recommend that other people think about for stability?
I'm lucky enough to have gone through this and failed. So I know what it looks like, and I know I'm not doing that again. I've lost lots of money doing this, and I guess that's the best way to learn. If you lose money. So we all
get to learn from your experiences, Rob. Okay.
Exactly. So I don't do any commercial jobs anymore. No net 30s, nothing. Well, mine is 50% up payment, 50% up front no matter what.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then when we're done with the project, it's 50% no matter what. No net 30. We're not putting people on terms. Unless it's financed, but we're getting paid from the financing company, and as soon as we hit done on that job, we're getting our payment, and that's coming within 24 hours.
So that's a firm boundary for you.
Firm boundary, just because
you've been burned before.
And you gotta be diversified as a company. If you're relying too much on one contractor or one source of income, if they go out of business or God forbid something happens to them, it can affect you in a big way, and your company go out of business. If you split it up between thousands of customers, residential customers, if one customer doesn't pay, it's not gonna make that much of a difference. Obviously, it still sucks to lose some money,
right?
But it's not gonna shut your business down, or it's not gonna strangle your business.
Yeah, actually, that's the mergers and acquisitions and private equity experience speaking there. So it's a good reminder, you guys, that when you maybe another good rule of thumb to consider is when you're thinking about getting into larger scopes of work. One of the things that they look at in the private equity space is if a single customer is more than 20% of your revenue for the year or period, that's a big risk signal. That's a really hard hit to your business if something happens to that customer. And I know for a lot of you, the first time that you think about taking on that first big commercial scope, sometimes it's more than 20%. It might be 50% of your revenue that year. And it's just a really high risk area to be in. Are you thinking you're going to keep that boundary really firm, black and white, as you continue to grow? Or are you going to hit a point where you're like, well, now's the time, we're going to strategically start moving into these larger scopes?
No, that's all. We're going to stay 100% residential, and that's just that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, so. that's the strategy. Stick with
because we do have a plan to sell in 5 years, so we know where we need to be. We know what we have to have in place. We know what we got to show the firms. So we have and it's good that this just goes into business planning. You know, you need to know your 1-year goal, you need to know your 3-year goal, you need to know your 5-year goal. And not only do you need to know it, you need to know how to get there. So how many trucks do you have on the road? How many technicians is that? How many people are you going to hire? How many CSRs do you need? You need to know all these things in order to get to where you need to go. You can't just say, yeah, I want to get to 90 million. But how do you do that? You know, how many techs do you need? How many trucks do you need to finance? How many customers do you need? What customers do you need? What percent is going to be HVAC? What percent is going to be plumbing? So you need to know all these things in order if you want to get there.
Yeah, having that clarity of vision makes it a lot easier to try to execute against.
Yeah, absolutely. Then you're not just running the business blindly. You wake up every day, you know what you need to hit. You're focusing on revenue generating task. You're worried about the next 5 minutes, and you're just trying to win the day. So
nice. This was a really solid session on cash flow, Rob. Thank you so much for spending the time with me. Any last thoughts or takeaways that you would want to encourage our pros listening to consider when it comes to cash flow?
Yeah, you need to know your numbers. So every day you need to be looking at your cash flow and what's coming in, and then you need to know weekly as well. And then you need to see that way, if you know what you're doing weekly, how many texts you got, what you're doing daily. If you have a bad day or a bad week, you can kind of go in there and go look at the reporting and see why you're having that bad day or why you're having that week, and you can nip it in the butt right away. You're not waiting until your bank account's drained and then it's kind of, you don't have any resources at that point. You're kind of screwed at that point. So you need to know your numbers, and then not only know your numbers, you need to know how to execute or implement things in place in order to take care of the problems that are at hand.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So helpful, really, really insightful. And I'll put one last kind of actionable takeaway on exactly what you said, which is those of you who feel like cash flow is something that you're struggling to wrap your hands around, what Rob just mentioned about really looking at this on a daily or weekly basis, a great tip and something that you might consider. The first part of it is looking at your bank account, where you are right now, and maybe what you owe your vendors in the next couple of weeks. But one of the best ways that I've seen for pros to look at this is take a look at your schedule, right? This might not be at the invoice level yet, but you know what projects you have on the books. And so if you look at your schedule week by week, and if you have a really tight black and white system like Rob has, where you know exactly what you're collecting, day by day for each of those projects, you can use your project schedule to build a projected cash flow income stream.
Absolutely.
So you can see week over week what cash you're going to be collecting based on the jobs that you have scheduled, and you can finesse it from there. So.
Yeah, 100%. And that goes back to having a clear goal. If you have a clear 1-year goal or 2-year goal, you can say how much you need to collect daily in order to get to that goal. And if one day you don't hit that daily goal of revenue collected, you can go and say, well, you can look at the schedule. You can look at maybe a tech was having a bad day. It's such a dynamic business. There's so many different things that could go wrong. But if you can figure out what those things are going wrong and fix it so it doesn't happen again in the future, you're going to hit your goals and you're not going to have any bumps in the road.
Absolutely. So. This was really high impact. Rob, thank you for coming all the way from Chicago to spend time with this session, to talk to the pros. And we'll look forward to catching you guys in the next one.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
If you'd like help building your cash flow model or want to explore the tools that make this easier, join the breakouts. You'll find guidance, demos, and other pros sharing what works for them.